Ron Maxwell, will present Civil War Filmmaking. I'd like to share a few things about Ron Maxwell with you. He is an independent filmmaker, screenwriter, and director. A native of New Jersey, Maxwell graduated from New York University's Institute of Film in 1970 and is a member of the Writers Guild of America, Directors Guild of America, and the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. He's most famous for his writing and directing of the American Civil War epics Gettysburg in 1993 and Gods and Generals in 2003. His third Civil War film, Copperhead, made its world premiere at the Majestic Theater here in Gettysburg on June 27th and opened nationwide on June 28th. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Ron Maxwell.
Hi, great to be with you. I hope you're managing somehow to stay cool. Just like our ancestors 150 years ago, we got a hot, humid day here. I prepared some remarks, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. I'm going to be reading the remarks from this edition that was just published last week. This is the latest edition of The Copperhead that was published originally in 1893 by Harold Frederick. Those of you who may have already read it know that the current editions prior to this one, there's a lot of typos. The typeset isn't interesting. It's just difficult to read. Well, that's all been cleaned up. It's a much more easy to read version. It's also got the screenplay written by Bill Kaufman in the back, and the artwork, as you can see, the artwork of the film. So I'm going to be commenting on some of the remarks that are the introduction that was written by Bill Kaufman, and throwing in some of my own remarks along the way. Harold Frederick was born in 1856, a native of Utica, which, though it is the 8th largest city in New York, can fairly claim a stake to being, pound for pound, the literary capital of the state. Frederick lived a short but full, perhaps overly full, life. In brief, he began his career as a Utica and later Albany newspaper editor, in which capacity he was celebrated as a wit and a bon vivant. He was a good friend of fellow upstater and U.S. President Grover Cleveland, whose Jeffersonian Democratic political convictions Frederick shared. He left his native grounds for good in 1884 to become a New York Times foreign correspondent based in London. Between 1886 and his death in 1898, he published more than a dozen books, most famously The Damnation of Theron Ware, a tale of a simple upstate Methodist minister's loss of faith, which is widely considered a masterpiece of late 19th century American realism. F. Scott Fitzgerald called The Damnation of Theron Ware the best American novel written before 1920. I guess that's because he was writing after 1920. Frederick was also a bigamist whose wife and mistress and their collected children lived about 15 miles apart in the precincts of London. He spent weekdays with one family and weekends with another. He suffered a stroke and died in 1898. The Copperhead, its title taken from the derisive serpentine epithet applied to Northern critics of the Civil War, was serialized in Scribner's magazine in 1893 and published in book form the same year. It was brought out in England the next year as The Copperhead and Other Stories of the North in the American Civil War. The novel, or novella, or longish short story if you prefer, would reappear in several collections of Frederick's fiction, most notably in the Civil War stories of Harold Frederick, under the imprint of Syracuse University Press, and with an introduction by Edmund Wilson. In every incarnation, it sold poorly, as Frederick's work usually did. But then the Copperhead, as with his other stories of the Civil War, hit none of the expected notes. It catered to neither Battle Hymn of the Republic, Northern Righteousness, nor to Dixie's Southern Romanticism. Edmund Wilson, our greatest literary critic and a denizen of that magical literary ground surrounding Frederick's Utica, wrote that Frederick's stories of New York during the Civil War reflect the peculiar mixture of patriotism and disaffection which was characteristic of that region. Due to this, these stories differ fundamentally from any other Civil War fiction, and they have thus a unique historical as well as literary importance, close quote. There is an unblinking, unsentimental honesty to the Copperhead, as well as Frederick's other stories of the war. The fanfare and spangles, the soaring rhetoric and battlefield heroism, you'll find none of that on his York State home fronts. We are shown instead a little world pockmarked, drained of life, even by what and who is absent. Young men leave communities of which they are essential pieces. Some return intact, but irreparably altered. Some stagger home shattered. Others make the trip back in pine boxes. The normal rhythms of courtship are disrupted. The interdependence of small farms, crossroads shops, and little Protestant churches is unraveled, and we are given to understand that things will never be the same. Stephen Crane, whose own The Red Badge of Courage is commonly regarded as the great American Civil War novel, said of Frederick's Civil War tales that they, quote, illumined the great country back of the front line, back of the fight, the waiting women, the lightless windows, the tables set for 3 instead of 5, close quote. This is the side of the war that is most immediate for Americans, yet which seldom interests our artists, let alone our politicians, the war at home, the domestic consequences of our crusades. Angus McFadyen, who plays G in Copperhead, and in the film you notice we call it Copperhead, not the Copperhead, says that the story reminds him of The Deer Hunter, Michael Cimino's epic film exploring the devastation wrought upon a small Pennsylvania community by the Vietnam War. We hadn't thought of that, but Angus was, as is his wont, right about that. And his performance in the film, I think, is extraordinary. If you haven't seen it yet, I consider it a tour de force, his portrayal of G. Hagedorn. Frederick wrote The Copperhead, like almost all of his published fiction, while living in England. But as with a later skeptic of the war, Gore Vidal, although he lived abroad, he was no expatriate. He was rather a proprietary patriot. As he said, all 4 of my great-grandfathers had borne arms in the Revolutionary War, and one of them indeed somewhat indefinitely expanded on this record by fighting on both sides at once. Frederick believed that America was his country, which is why he felt no need to write spread-eagle stories about a war that had cost his home place blood and treasure, the lives of its young men, and the vigor of its communities. Typically, in a story of a dissenter, the author flatters himself and the audience. The deck is stacked. The cards are marked. Every right-thinking reader or viewer is confident that, of course, he or she would be at the side of this poor recusant who is being persecuted by narrow-minded peasants or by clerics who deny that the earth revolves around the sun, or that man is a product of evolution, or that the earth is older than 6,000 years, or that the Simon pure prisoner who was about to be lynched is innocent. But really, is there anything easier than standing at a very safe distance of years with Galileo or Scopes or the accused witches at Salem? Smugness is detestable. Only a complacent idiot enjoys burning straw men or crowing over his moral superiority to the benighted. Harold Frederick does not let the reader back or bask in his own sanctimony. It's so easy to say that you're for free speech, that you honor the First Amendment, that though you may not agree with so-and-so who says such and such, you'll defend to the death his right to say it. Well, here's Abner Beach, the leading character in the novel and the film, an upstate New York farmer of 1862. He thinks this war between the states, this hallowed war, this bloodletting out of which modern America was born, is an unconstitutional atrocity. He despises the soon-to-be martyred Abraham Lincoln, who by most 21st century lights is the greatest American hero. Abner stands up and speaks his piece during time of war. Okay, Mr. Free Speech, are you willing to defy the mob and defend Abner? It's not so easy. Quote, doing right ain't got no end, close quote, says the murderous Kansas red-legged fanatic who wipes out the title character's home and family in Clint Eastwood's masterpiece, The Outlaw Josie Wales. To assert otherwise in time of war, including our own age of war, is virtually an act of sedition. In The Copperhead, Abner Beach learns this lesson, and he learns it good and hard. G. Hagedorn, the abolitionist whom Frederick loathes, but whom we in the film have sought to humanize, is absolutely correct on the central moral question of the age, that is, the immorality of slavery. But G has subordinated all else, his family, his community, his daily responsibilities, to an abstraction. He sees only a forest and no trees. G is the archetypal religious fanatic who exults in war because God is on our side. In our film, if not in Frederick's novella, Abner does not concede 1 inch of Christian ground to the Bible-quoting G. He matches him verse for verse in a running colloquy between a New Testament man of peace and a thundering prophet of the Old Testament. Gore Vidal, in his essay on motion pictures, writes, quote, our writers and directors tend to know as little about the country's history as the audience. So when they set a story in the past, the characters are just like us, except they're in costume. But the past is another country. And to bring it to some sort of dramatic life takes a capacity for which there is no one English word, close quote. In our day, any imaginative leap into the past brings a flurry of charges that one must surely endorse every prejudice or social convention of that past, which is why such fictions usually feature an authorial alter ego whose attitudes are anachronistically, ridiculously au courant, and utterly unbelievable. The past in such works of art, or rather propaganda, sometimes crude, sometimes slick, is emptied of meaning, content, emptied of its pastness. It exists only to serve the modern and transient and tedious political needs of the author. But in our film, if it is any good, and if it can make any claims, it must be suffused and perfused and imbued with 1862. Otherwise, it's just moderns wearing period costumes and speaking like it's 2013. Copperhead the movie was born in a sense over breakfast at the Roger Sherman Inn in New Canaan, Connecticut, a breakfast shared by Bill Kaufman and myself. We'll remember that Roger Sherman was a great, if unheralded, patriot. He signed one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. He also co-authored with Luther Martin of Maryland and William Patterson of New Jersey the New Jersey Plan, the decentralist alternative to what became the Constitution at the Philadelphia Convention of 1787. So it was somewhat appropriate that it's at this breakfast in a restaurant called the Roger Sherman Inn that we we came upon this notion of turning the Copperhead into a motion picture. We'd spent the previous night at a meeting at the New Canaan Historical Society at which we were invited to speak on the Civil War. A questioner had asked me what my next movie might be, and I replied that I was always looking for fiction, for a story that might serve the basis for a next film. And it was over that next morning's breakfast that we mentioned the Copperhead. We don't remember whether Bill mentioned it first or I did, but whoever mentioned it first, the other guy said, "Oh, that's a great book." And here we are, 3.5 years later. Bill Kaufman and I had a deep and rich well to draw from in Harold Frederick's source novel. And if we veered away from his plot and characterizations, I hope the script and the movie are true to his brave spirit. Copperhead was filmed over 7 weeks at King's Landing, a historical living museum located about 20 miles from Fredericton, the lovely capital of the Canadian province of New Brunswick. Coincidentally, Peter Fonda, who is in the film, as you know, his family name graces the seat of Montgomery County, New York, about 50 miles east of Harold Frederick's Utica. Peter's father, Henry, appeared in film versions of 3 novels by Utica-era authors Walter E. Edmonds: Chad Hanna, The Farmer Takes a Wife, and Drums Along the Mohawk. There's this line in Harold Frederick's preface to his collection of books called In the 60s, quote, "It was at this time that I gathered the first materials for my projected work about the Revolutionary War from members of the Fonda and other families," close quote. Yes, that Fonda family. And so it comes full circle as Peter Fonda plays the critical role of Avery in Copperhead. I'm quoting now from Bill's introduction. Bill says, "I write every day with a photo of Eugene V. Debs tacked to the wall on my left. Debs, the leading American socialist of the early 20th century, and more importantly, a faithful citizen of Terre Haute, Indiana, was America's most famous martyr to wartime speech. There's a famous photo of Debs addressing an audience in Canton, Ohio in June 1918, in which he condemns U.S. entry into the First World War. And he says with wry prescience that, quote, "It is extremely dangerous to exercise the constitutional right of free speech in a country fighting to make democracy safe for the world," close quote. For speaking these words, Debs became one of 15,000 Americans jailed for violating President Woodrow Wilson's Espionage and Sedition Acts. As Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis explained when handing down a 20-year jail sentence in another such case, quote, "In times of peace, you have a legal right to oppose by free speech preparations for war. But when war is declared, that right ceases," close quote. Strange, isn't it? How the founders never got around to appending that footnote to the First Amendment. Copperhead critics of the Civil War were often persecuted too, if not to the extent that dissenters from the First World War were. They were persecuted. Newspapers were shut down, anti-war editors and speakers were imprisoned, habeas corpus took a holiday. War is always the enemy of liberty and free speech. Those who wish to investigate the Copperheads further might read the works of the late historian and Marquette University professor Frank Clement, the Dean of Scholarly Studies of Northern Opposition to the Civil War. Clement was a product of the University of Wisconsin's legendary history department and shared its populist Middle American orientation. He demolished the myth that the Copperheads were disloyal pro-Southern traitors and demonstrated that by and large they were honorable dissenters. Quote, "Democratic critics of the Lincoln administration who opposed the changes that the Civil War foisted upon the country," close quote. Significantly, Frank Clement came of an age as a historian during the Truman-McCarthy Cold War Red Scare, which he viewed as a witch hunt. This surely colored his view of the Copperheads, for as Clement told an interviewer, quote, "You can't separate a historian's philosophy of life or the era in which he lives from his scholarship," close quote. We now live in a time in a country which finds principled dissent of the sort exercised by Eugene V. Debs and the character Abner Beach in the film almost incomprehensible. In one sense, freedom of expression knows no bounds. Internet pornography, snuff game videos, libelous tweets, laissez-faire man. But with respect to politics, art, and culture, seldom in American history have the limits of permissible speech been so narrow, so constricting. True, our Eugene Debses aren't usually thrown into jails, but nor do they become cause célèbre like Debs in his own day. Their prison, and ours, is the red state, blue state idiocy under which the limits of acceptable opinion are demarcated. And writers live in fear of saying the wrong thing and running afoul of the hall monitors and tattletales who police American discourse. Harold Frederick and Edmund Wilson and Gore Vidal and pretty much any writer on American subjects who is worth a damn does not fit the liberal conservative straitjacket. The very premise of Copperhead, that some honorable men of the North resisted Lincoln's call to arms, whether from commitment to Jeffersonian democracy or pacifism or wrongheadedness or the awful presentiment that war would remake the country, will enrage the enforcers of opinion orthodoxy who insist that there is only one acceptable narrative, and a boring one of that, of American history. Nationalist, consolidationist, and social democratic at home, and world-saving militarist abroad. There is no room in this carefully monitored and barren storyline for Abner Beach or Marai or his son Jeff, or even G. Hagedorn, his daughter Esther, or Nye Hagedorn. These men and women have been written out of American history. This film lets them back in. In his preface to In the 60s, Harold Frederick explained, quote, "There remains the volume of collected stories, long and short, dealing with varying aspects of home life in the North, or rather in my little part of the North during the Civil War. These stories are by far closer to my heart than any other work of mine, partly because they seem to me to contain the best things I have done or shall ever do, partly because they are so closely interwoven with the personal memories and experiences of my own childhood, and a little also, no doubt, for the reason that they have not quite had the treatment outside that paternal affection had desired for them. These stories of mine are in large part my own recollections of that dreadful time, the actual things that a boy from 5 to 9 saw and heard about him while his own relatives were being killed and his schoolfellows orphaned and women of his neighborhood forced into mourning and despair in the earliest stages of their life. And they had a right to be recorded," close quote. Yes, they did. Our film Copperhead does not preach or hector or demonize. It is not an advocacy film. For why did we redesign the character of Avery, make him the spokesman for the pro-Lincoln, pro-war side, and cast an iconic American actor to play him? Nor is it a message movie, except as a plea for tolerance, or should I say the reappearance in our America of dissenting opinions. It is nothing more or less than a story squarely and defiantly in the American grain about a town and 2 families and the way they are ripped apart by a war that is so very far away and yet so devastatingly close. It is about a war waged at and upon home. It is a story as old as moldering bone fragments at Antietam and as fresh as the tears a mother cries as her son or daughter leaves to fight in faraway wars today. A nation cannot live on myth alone. War, as one who prosecuted it with especial vigor once said, is hell. A people who forget this are destined never again to know peace. Thank you.
right, so we went to see the movie this week and enjoyed it. This is just a question about the movie, about the filming. So the house that burned down in the settlement, was that really a house in the settlement that you burned down, or was that one you built for burning down?
If you heard the questioner asked if the house burned down in the movie, pretend you didn't hear that. Spoiler alert. Well, let me just say, we filmed at a historical settlement, which is like a museum town. Has anybody here been to King's Landing? Yes, some folks have been. It's really worth a visit. It's beautiful. In the 1960s, a dam was put in the St. Johns River, and many communities were going to get flooded out. And some far-thinking people thought we should save some of this architecture. So they collected houses and barns and churches and all sorts of buildings before the river valley was flooded, and then a generation later they put them all together in this area. And of course they're historical buildings, so we're not about to burn one of those houses down. No, anything that looks like it's getting destroyed or defaced or burned in Copperhead is a set that we built.
What has inspired or motivated you to spend so much time in your career filmmaking Civil War films or in and around the Civil War?
Honestly, if I knew how much time it would be, I probably never would have got started. I didn't know it was going to take 15 years from start to finish to make Gettysburg. Damon is here. Damon Resch, who was my personal assistant on Gettysburg. We hardly recognize each other now. It's been so long. But I'm awful glad to see you, Damon. It took 15 years from the time I first read The Killer Angel until the time that movie was, in theaters. I don't know whether that's a comment on my own incompetence or what, but it took a while. And then another 10 years to do Gods and Generals, and now it's been another 10 years since, although we've only spent short of 4 years actually working on Copperhead. Well, it's been a rich, rewarding experience to go into this area. I mean, I have other projects. I've got one that takes place in medieval France. I've got a Western I've been working on. I've got one that takes place in World War II. And I'm working on them all at the same time. And it just works out that the ones that get financed are the Civil War ones. And maybe because since Gettysburg, those who are able to finance movies just say, oh, I'm the Civil War guy. But, so I think there's some of that. We get typecast. And it's not because I'm not interested in it. Of course I am. But as far as getting movies cost a lot of money, tens of millions of dollars. And so the stars have to align in a certain way. And there may be another Civil War in my future or not. Who knows?
Thank you. Mr. Maxwell, I met you in Huntsville, Alabama when you came for your debut there. So I was curious if you could make some contrast with some of the issues and opinions that you might have heard there or met there in some of your other studies, the Southern issues. And then second question is, what is it you look for in a new novel or a new idea for the next film?
Well, certainly, we've the movie opened this past Friday in about 50 theaters. It's not a lot of theaters considering how big America is, and that there's I think 20,000 screens. But it's an independent film, so we open small, and we hope that it'll, by word of mouth, go wider. We're going to, on July 19th, open in another 50 screens, including the big cities, New York, L.A., Chicago. It's also available simultaneously on pay-per-view, so those who don't want to wait till it comes to a theater near you, you could end up waiting months. You can see it right now on pay-per-view on all the platforms. But along the way, before we opened, we had 21 pre-screenings all over the country in Alabama, Georgia, New Jersey, Rhode Island, upstate New York, Canada, Missouri, Gettysburg. I'm leaving out, obviously, another dozen places. And every one of these screenings has been followed by a Q&A. And I don't mean to be bragging when I say this, because I know that for everybody who likes the film, there's going to be a major critic who's going to say it's the worst thing they ever saw. So I'm used to this. But I just to report to you the truth, every one of these screenings had a standing ovation, every single one. People were on their feet applauding. So we know we hit a chord with people all over the country. And I think what they were responding to was the fact that they finally saw a movie about the home front, about the people left behind when the soldiers go away. I think that's one of the main reasons people have responded so heartwarmingly to the film. And I think also, no matter where you are in the political spectrum today, the fact that I think people understand that there's a degradation of the debate, that most people would prefer to have a civil conversation. I think that's where most of us are. And yet we look around and we see people yelling at each other and talking past each other and caricaturing people that don't agree with them. And that's a kind of a dehumanization. And I think we all sense that, hey, we don't want to go down that road. And this is a film about a community that's torn apart because people can't talk to one another anymore. And they start to take factions and sides. And we see the devastation that happens in this little community, which is hundreds of miles away from the front lines. And we understand that no one could escape that war. So I think that's part of the response, too. There's a response in the audience that we want to be civil, darn it. And I think that's part of why people are on their feet. And then, who knows, I mean, I think they're also looking at some wonderful acting. I think the actors in this film are quite marvelous. And they're very compelling, and I think you relate to them, and you feel for them, and you feel for the entire generation that suffered in that war. Also, to the extent that we have seen the home front, starting with Gone with the Wind and maybe here and there since, it's usually been the home front in the South, which is understandable because that's where the war was waged, except for where we are now. In Adams County and these regions. And so I think it was kind of enlightening and somewhat surprising to see that even the communities that weren't impacted directly by the war, there was no fighting going on, could not escape. But as far as future projects goes, well, Copperhead interested me because for me it was moving in an entirely new direction. So I was going into an era that I had not explored, and therefore I thought it would be interesting for me to spend how many years, who knew, and interesting, therefore, for an audience. So something has to appeal to me intellectually, emotionally, artistically, at many levels, because once I say, oh, I want to make this movie, it could be 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, the rest of my life, or I could not make it. So when you put into your head the idea you may never even get to make the film, you better be highly motivated to start down that road.
Have you studied the recent return of the veterans movements, especially amongst their spouses, for advocating for health care for returning veterans, especially around mental health care, with regards to people really finding voice and dissenting? I've recently been working with some of the veterans on that issue, and I'm wondering, have you looked at that at all?
Well, one of the places we had a pre-release screening was at the GI Film Festival in Arlington a couple of months ago now. And, I mean, in the film, in Copperhead, you see some boys come back terribly wounded. You see others coming back in pine boxes. And I was wondering, very curious to see how this movie was going to play for an audience of veterans. And there were mostly veterans in that audience. Recent veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, and some obviously, bore the wounds of war. You couldn't miss it. And that audience gave it a standing ovation. And many veterans in that audience came up to me afterwards and thanked me for the film. It was very emotional. My father was a World War II veteran. And I think I've had a couple of invitations. I said, Ron, could you arrange to have this film shown like for Wounded Warriors and other places just to help raise money? I said, oh, yeah. And we are working on a screening in San Antonio for a benefit for Wounded Warriors. Because I think one thing we can all agree on, regardless of whether we think this war was right or this war was right or wrong and was it the right policy, we all agree that those who are called to defend their country always deserve our respect. And I think that's what you see in the movie Copperhead, and certainly what you saw in the movies Gettysburg and Gods and Generals.
can you tell us an experience, humorous experience with one of the actors or actresses that you've had in your films? And also, what was your most difficult scene that you've had to direct?
It's a difficult question because it could be such a huge answer, and I will try to keep it brief. The challenge in any movie is to get to the heart of the matter. And in these kinds of movies, the ones that I make, it's all about the actors. I mean, the actors have to do it. If all you have is the panorama of battle and the great photography and great motion picture score, and the actors don't deliver the reality of those people, there's no movie. So the casting is very important, and then working with the actors to protect them and to give them an environment where they can do what they can do, which is kind of magic, becoming those people. Imbuing those people with life. It's kind of an act of cinematic resurrection, whether they're playing people from history that we know, like Lee and Longstreet and Chamberlain, or fictitious people like Abner Beach and G. Hagedorn. So my challenge is, no matter what the logistical demands of the day, even if I've got 5,000 reenactors in the shot and cannons going off, it's really about Armistead in the foreground. That's what it's about. I can't forget that. Otherwise, it won't work. And so that's kind of a discipline that I've learned, to just never take my eye off that ball.
Oh, hi. I was wondering about, just in relation to characters, you hear authors talk about how they sort of live with their subjects. And I was wondering if, of all the Civil War characters that you've portrayed in your movies, who do you find the most fascinating? Like, who did you enjoy living with the most? And I also wonder, when you read a book or are thinking about a future project, do you have certain actors in mind? Or did you ever, as you're reading the book, can you picture somebody playing that person?
Well, I'm sure many of you here are writers. Some of you may be filmmakers. We all imagine, we all dream. And that's the beginning of any creative work, is the dream life. Reading Michael Shara's novel, we all see it in our own eyes, long before you see the movie Gettysburg. We envisage it the way that Michael Shara has written about it, and we dream about it. And everyone here has read tons of stuff in the Civil War biographies, famous and less famous and obscure people. Many of you have the diaries of your own ancestors. And so it does take, filmmaking is ultimately an act of the imagination. Yes, we want to do the historical research and get it right, and I always grab onto the best historians I could find in the research and the writing of the script and all through the making of the film. That way, if anything's wrong, I can blame them. But ultimately, it's an act of the imagination, whether you're a painter, a sculptor, a musician, a filmmaker, a novelist. And so in that process, you do commune with these people. I feel like I've spent a big chunk of my life with Thomas Jonathan Jackson. I feel like I know him. Same with Joshua Chamberlain. Same with Anna Jackson. I feel like I know these people almost better than I know the flesh and blood people in my own life, which is why it informs me to make the movies with compassion and understanding. And I've been criticized for this, which is okay. When you make movies, you got to expect that. But certainly, all three movies taken together, I think you feel the compassion that this filmmaker has for everyone, for the whole generation, whether they were wearing blue or gray, whether they were black or white, whether they were civilians or in the military. Because it's ultimately, yes, it's heroic. Yes, there's incredible characters, but it's ultimately so sad. And they already suffered, and they are no longer with us. And so we have their suffering that informs us and their sacrifice that informs us. And I think we can only be better for it the more we really try to know them.
Yes, Mr. Maxwell, I applaud you making this film about Harold Frederick's novel. I'm one of the few people who's read The Damnation of Theron Ware. But I want to ask you this question about Bill Kaufman. does he ever tell you that the hero of Culp's Hill, General James Wadsworth, is from just outside of his hometown in Batavia, and that James Wadsworth's grandson, James W. Wadsworth, sponsored the conscription legislation for both World War I and World War II? I mean, Bill Kaufman's portrayal of Batavia is about as authentic as Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm.
Oh, well, I'll share that with him, your challenge. But he has a website, so you should. But the reason I mentioned his website, you should share that with him directly on the website. I think he'd be responsive. I don't know whether he knows about the general or not. Okay. Okay. Well, I'll share that with him, but I recommend you follow up with him directly. He'll probably engage you. Thank you. Anybody else?
Yep, right here. Yep. Mr. Maxwell, I just always wondered who you thought brought out Robert E. Lee the best in both your movies. What your feeling on that was?
Thomas Ficino, the Renaissance writer, said famously, or wrote famously, when confronted with a difficult choice, choose both. Yes, thank you. Thank you. But to further answer your question, remember the book is called, the movie is based on The Killer Angels. So I think that maybe, look, no two actors are going to play Lee the same any more than no two actors are going to play Hamlet the same. That's why we go back and see that play over and over again. And I think maybe Marty Sheen brought more of the angel, and Bobby Duvall brought more of the killer.
Just a quick question. How hard was it for you to direct George Pickett as Tom Jackson?
Pickett's charge?
No, how hard was it for you to direct George Pickett as Tom Jackson?
Oh, okay. Well, I just, Stephen Lang is an actor's actor. There's practically nothing he can't do. And some of you know the story of how that came about. He was going to reprise Pickett in Gods and Generals. And Marty Sheen was going to reprise, we were going to bring everybody back, essentially. And then in the 11th hour, some people had conflicts, pre-existing conflicts or new conflicts. And so that's how Bobby Duvall came in the second movie. And we had another actor that was all lined up to play the lead as Jackson. And it was like 4 or 5 weeks before shooting that just didn't work out. And we looked around, and I remember saying, I just need a really good actor here. We can't play this chase the star game. We didn't have that much time to go after one of those 10 names, big box office names who would be right. And I just called Ted Turner. I said, I think we just got to abandon the idea of getting one of these $10 million actors and just get a really good actor, because we're running out of time here. And I suggested Stephen Lang, and Turner concurred, and that's how Steve got the part. And I thought he did a great job.
I just wondered if you'll be making The Last Full Measure.
It'll probably take The Last Full Measure for me to do it. It's look, it's a big, sprawling, very expensive film. It's the wilderness, Petersburg. Imagine, Appomattox, huge cast. Of course, we couldn't get any of the actors back because I can get away with looking 20 years older, but they cannot. Who knows? I mean, it could happen, but to be straight with you, it's not on the front burner, so anything is possible.
My question is also about Stephen Lang. Who do you think you played better, George Pickett or Jackson?
Yes, I'm going to give you the same answer I give this gentleman over here. He did a great job with both. I'm sure you all have your preferences.
As far as I know, you're the only director who's been allowed to make a major motion picture actually here on the grounds of Gettysburg, and I wondered how that was as an experience for you.
Well, it worked out. It took some doing. Early on, the first response is no, and I can understand that because the people in charge are in charge of protecting it. It belongs to us all, and they're gonna. It's got to be protected. It's a resource. It's also a graveyard. Nobody wants it trashed in any way, shape, or form. So the thought of a Hollywood movie crew coming in here for a whole summer, the immediate response was, "This is not a good idea." But then we had conversations, and they were kind of, to oversimplify them, it was conversation like, okay, you guys wear the Smokey Bear hats and we wear the baseball caps, but we're all Americans, and it belongs to all of us, and let's work together. And then the other day, that's what happened. And once we got into the filming, the people who were in charge of the park at that time were actually grateful that we were here, and we had a great time together. We worked hand in glove.
Yeah, Ron, I was just wondering, how did you go through the editing of Gods and Generals to cut out certain actual battles rather than having it go longer? What was the thinking in that?
So I guess you're referring to the difference between the theatrical version of Gods and Generals and the director's cut, which is an hour longer, which has Antietam in it, and John Wilkes Booth, and more camp life, and more civilian life. Well, at 5 hours, we were just not going to release a theatrical film. Well, there was an option in discussion at Warner Brothers of releasing two movies, two 2.5-hour movies over 2 years, which was probably what we should have done, but that hindsight is always 20/20. Instead, we said, well, let's try to get it as short as we can and still have one story. And so by doing that, it became more Jackson and less of Jackson and Chamberlain and the Yankees, just by condensing it. So I prefer the director's cut because it's the whole thing. But that's how that happened. Thanks so much. Great to be with you.